2 decades. Dr. Seeley earned his PhD in Hebrew Bible and Ancient Near Eastern Studies at the University of Michigan. He has spent a great deal of time studying the Jerusalem Temple, and he also has a great interest in Josephus. So we're privileged to have him combine those 2 interests today. He'll be speaking to us on Josephus and Temple. Dr. Seeley.
I was a little nervous about this, and I told my colleague Bill Hamblin, I said, but it's only 20 minutes. Bill Hamblin said, a lot of bad things can happen in 20 minutes. So let's enjoy the next 20 minutes. I'm here to speak to you about a man named Josephus. Josephus is a name that's really familiar to members of the church. And he has a whole amount of authority. In fact, we have a game we play in our family, and the game is this. When you're sitting in a Sunday school class and you're very, very bored, raise your hand and say, Josephus said. Then you can say almost anything you want, and people will sort of almost believe you. Josephus wrote 4 works. He wrote a work called Jewish War. He wrote a work called Antiquities. He wrote a work defending Judaism called Against Appian, and he wrote his autobiography. So we know a lot about this person, and we know a lot about the world that he lived in from his point of view. In fact, one of the great strengths of Josephus is he's prolific. One of the great weaknesses of studying Josephus is a lot of the people that lived around him at the time hasn't been preserved, their words. So the study of Josephus is really important. Today I want to talk about the Tabernacle as Cosmos and Josephus' Antiquities. Originally I picked the topic Josephus and the Temple, which of course is way, 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 way too vast. Okay? So I picked what I think is the most interesting idea that Josephus gives us in his writings, the Tabernacle as Cosmos. Later it'll be the Temple of Cosmos. He has various descriptions of the Temple and the Tabernacle in his work, but we're going to concentrate on Antiquities. Now, the book of Antiquities is a retelling of the Bible, from Adam and Eve all the way up into just the period before the Jewish War in the lifetime of Josephus. It consists of 20 volumes, so it's a very, very long work. And Josephus, at the very beginning, he tells us this. This narrative will, therefore, in due course, set forth the precise details of what is in the Scriptures according to its proper order. For I promised that I would do this throughout this treatise, neither adding nor omitting anything. Now, Josephus does anything but that. In fact, if he had recounted to us the entire Hebrew Bible in 20 books, none of us would ever have any interest in reading it all, right? Because judging from gospel doctrine class, nobody reads the Old Testament in the Bible anyway. The book of Antiquities is interesting to us because, in fact, he doesn't do exactly this in terms of adding or omitting. He adds lots of things and he omits lots of things. And one of the interesting things about study of Josephus is to evaluate what he's telling us by a very simple criterion. What has he deleted in this story? I'm going to read you a list. This is the list of the big episodes he's deleted, not just the smaller details. Jacob's deception of his father Isaac, Tamar Judah episode, Moses killing the Egyptian, the golden calf episode. You can imagine here he's making Old Testament to be read at family home evening. And I'll never forget the family home evening in which we read the Judah Tamar story with 2 children in the room under the age of 10. And then we looked at each other and we thought, now, what were we thinking? Reading the Old Testament. So we did Leviticus the next week. The golden calf episode, the story of the brazen serpent, the story of Gideon smashing the Baal altar, and Elisha's cursing of the little boys. Now, some of those stories, you can instantly tell why these wouldn't be a great story. But some of these stories are interesting. For example, we have a sense, because Josephus tells us this, that his audience is a Hellenistic Roman audience that might not have responded so well to the idea of breaking idols, for example. So we can see those stories out. Josephus leaves out the custom of circumcision, which might not have resonated so well with some of his audience. So we can tell lots of things by what he left out. He also added some things. The most spectacular thing that he added was a very long narrative about Moses' campaign as a military leader in Egypt against the Ethiopians, where he met and he married what was to be his wife, the Ethiopian princess, which is referred to in the Miriam and Aaron story as his Cushite wife. All right, so we have a huge episode there that we know nothing about from the Bible. He has made additions to the stories of Cain and Abel, Jacob, Joseph, Samson, and many, many, many others. There's lots of additions. Today we've chosen to talk about the addition he's made to the text of the description of the tabernacle as the cosmos. Okay, so we want to explore this idea as presented to us by Josephus. If someone should investigate the construction of the tent and should observe the clothing and the vestals of the priest that we use for the sacred service, he would find that our lawgiver, and he means Moses here, was a man of God, and that the slanders that we hear from others are unfounded. For he will find that each of these is a imitation and representation of the universe, if someone should be willing to consider them ungrudgingly and with understanding. That's a great idea. And I find that we Latter-day Saints love the idea of temple as cosmos. We love the idea, and I'm going to give you a little note here. Josephus often refers to the tabernacle as the temple. And in fact, in other passages, he refers to the temple as cosmos as well. This is a quote from Josephus, he built the tabernacle, and it differed not at all from a portable and wandering temple. So in our discussion today, the temple or the tabernacle as cosmos are synonymous. There's probably some differences we could make, but for us, they're synonymous. It's an idea that resonates with Latter-day Saints, and I've always tried to analyze this. Like, if you ever want an audience of Latter-day Saints, what do? Put in the headline, Temple and Cosmos, right? Everybody will come. I think it's because we actually do believe what happens at the temple has cosmic import. And we believe that temples are connected with the heavens, the earth, with the living and the dead. So this is a really, really important idea for Latter-day Saints, and one that we value highly. And then we're just going to read a couple of passages from Josephus that shows exactly what his definition of this is. And I've divided these out sort of by categories. The tabernacle is sacred space. It happened that such an arrangement of the tent was also an imitation of the nature of the universe. By dividing the tent, which is 30 cubits long, into 3 parts, and designating 2 of them for all the priests as a place accessible and in common, he signifies the earth and sea, for these also are accessible to all. But he earmarked the 3rd part for God alone because of the fact that the heaven also is inaccessible to men. So here we have the sacred space of the tabernacle is in fact a mirror of the cosmos. Okay? He identifies the 12 loaves of bread as 12 months, the candelabras with the 7 planets or heavenly bodies, that's the planets including the sun and the moon. The 12 stones on the breastplate he claims are like the zodiac. Okay? He talks about the veils and priestly robes. The pieces of cloth represent the 4 elements, the earth, the sea, the air, the fire, the tunic representing the earth. Really interesting note, the pomegranates and the bells represent lightnings and thunders. The belt, the sea, the onyx stones, the sun and the moon, and the cap, the heavens. In other words, he's assigned cosmic significance to each part of what we would have seen at the tabernacle complex. In Jewish War, there's another really, really interesting quote he gives us here, talking about the death of 2 of the high priests and their corpses lying in the street. He says, So those who a little earlier had upon themselves the priestly raiment and were celebrating the cosmic worship. He speaks about the high priestly clothing as somehow related to this cosmic worship, a fascinating phrase, actually, that we can explore at length on another occasion. No one's quite sure what this means, if the priests were leading the cosmos in worship, if they were representing God in the cosmos, if they represent the cosmos before the Lord. There's lots of things that can go on here. There's a similar phrase actually in the book of Hebrews that talks about Jesus as a high priest like this. 2 interrelated but separate ideas. In my work on this topic, something has dawned on me that's stated by a man named Jonathan Clowens. There are actually 2 ideas when we talk about cosmic symbolism. The first is the temple as a symbol of the cosmos, and the second is the heavenly temple analogous to the sanctuary located in heaven. In other words, the earthly tabernacle and the heavenly tabernacle. I think there's a lot of sloppiness that goes on in discussions of this, mixing these 2 ideas. And Clowens agrees with me, so I'm sure he's right. But we're only going to talk about the first idea. The second idea is here too, also in Josephus and other places. But we're just talking about the first idea, the temple or the tabernacle as a model of the cosmos. Now here's the 4 questions that we want to address here. Number 1, where does he get this idea? Number 2, does this idea continue in Judaism after Josephus? Number 3, why does Josephus include this idea in his work? And number 4, what might this idea mean in terms of the history of Judaism? And what I've chosen to do today is sort of broadly go over this material so we can cover a lot of ground instead of a little bit of ground. We could do a little bit of ground too, but I think that'll be more valuable to us today. So question number 1, the possible sources for the idea of temple as cosmos that would have been available to Josephus. Most of us as Latter-day Saints are familiar with the work of Brother Nibley, who showed that ancient Near Eastern history and culture, and Brother Lundquist, represents this idea as temples as cosmos. It's a very old idea, has lots of different manifestations. The second one would be the idea of coming from the Hebrew Bible. The third one, coming from the Hellenistic culture around him. Related to that is the fourth idea. Does he get this from Philo? And the final idea is the common Jewish tradition. And as you know anything about giving presentations, you always put the idea that you think's most likely last, right? So you end up there, so it all makes everybody feel like you're going the right direction, right? There's lots to be done in this scholarship on this, but I want to quickly do this. Ancient Near Eastern history, as we just talked about, there's lots of very ancient traditions of temples of cosmos, and the cosmic mountain, and the assignment of the different parts of Egyptian and Mesopotamian temples. Ziggurats, for example, named after the great mountain and things like that. But there's no evidence in Josephus that he's consciously following these traditions. In other words, we've got to find something in Josephus that says, oh yeah, he knows this, he knows this. He simply states it. So even though this might be behind everything Josephus is doing, we can't find the data that puts him there. Number two, the biblical traditions. Latter-day Saints are always also quite familiar with these traditions. The Bible does compare the building of the tabernacle to the creation story. And it does that with all sorts of use of sevens and the language of God pronouncing the work is done, like Moses pronouncing the work is done in the tabernacle. There's a huge narrative strategy in the Bible that presents the tabernacle as creation. Josephus, oddly enough, completely destroys that narrative pattern by leaving out the model part. In other words, when in the Bible, when God goes, or Moses goes on Sinai to God, and God says, I'll give you the plan of the tabernacle. Remember those long 5 chapters there, and then 4 chapters later, the same 5 chapters, remember, as they build it. Josephus has just eliminated that. So he's eliminated that narrative actually on here. Some see some really far-fetched allusions to cosmic imagery in the Bible, such as the 7 eyes in Zechariah, or there's an allusion to thunder and lightning that might relate it to pomegranates and bells. But none of these specific traditions can be tracked in Josephus in terms of this idea. 3, Hellenistic culture. Now here there's something interesting. At the time of Josephus, there was an idea that's largely held by Cynics and Stoics that, in fact, the cosmos was a temple. I'm just going to read you one quote here from Pseudo-Heraclitus. You ignorant men, don't you know that God is not wrought by hands and has not from the beginning had a pedestal and does not have a single enclosure? Rather, the whole world is his temple, decorated with animals, planets, and stars. There's a sense in which this idea of temples cosmos would have resonated with the audience of Josephus at this time. So we're going to come back to that in just a minute. D, Philo. This is a great topic. Philo has 2 entire works describing the tabernacle as the cosmos. Okay, and he gives a detailed kind of assignment of meaning just like Josephus. Now the question whether Josephus knows Philo or not is a really hard one, and scholars are divided on this. Okay, the consensus seems to be he doesn't know Philo. He doesn't read Philo. He doesn't do allegory like Philo. Josephus does allegory sort of just spur of the moment. Oh, this must represent this. Whereas Josephus, of course, has a long program of teaching Platonic kinds of things by his associations. And in most cases, Philo and Josephus don't share enough common ground. But here they do. So if Josephus knows Philo, it's here that he knows him in terms of the data. I've got a little chart here that gets messed up when you start doing these wonderful kinds of formatting here. But you can clearly see that Philo and Josephus share an idea that the symbols might be the same in terms of the tabernacle as the cosmos. Finally, Jewish traditions. And this is really, really simple, and that is that other Jewish traditions at the time of Josephus or before Josephus, such as the Wisdom of Solomon, the Letter of Aristeas, such as Philo, they know this idea. And we also know that this idea has survived in the text that's been preserved within Rabbinic Judaism, and it's called Midrash Tadshe. And Midrash Tadshe gives us almost exactly the same idea that was preserved by Josephus and Philo. So, the common consensus of scholarship is that Philo knows this idea from a Jewish tradition, a Jewish priestly temple tradition that's also known by Philo, and that's also known by other Jewish writers, okay, because they share the idea and then it's preserved, finally. So our best solution is that this is one of these Jewish traditions. See there, I just state what I just told you. The most logical conclusion of these works all share knowledge of a common Jewish tradition. Number two, the tradition does continue in this rabbinic text, but we need to say something here. The bulk of rabbinic literature does not preserve this tradition. It survives within the tradition, but it's not mainstream. The mainstream rabbinic tradition is that the tabernacle represents the heavenly tabernacle, which I tried to argue at the beginning is actually a different idea. It's a related idea, but it's a different idea than to say the tabernacle is the universe here. We can't hate this text, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but that's how our line of reasoning works. Number three, why would Josephus include this idea in his work? And a really profound thing that you can always ask yourself in reading a text like this is, to whom is Josephus writing? And the most obvious thing you can deduce is he's writing to someone who knows Greek, right? Because he writes in Greek. How profound is that, right? We don't know why he wrote in Greek, actually. Our suspicion is because he knows it better than Latin, because he probably could have gotten by in writing in Latin here to the kind of audience he's targeting here. But it's clear to us that from the beginning of Antiquities, Josephus tells us his audience is to all the Greeks, okay? His audience is not primarily a Jewish audience. And almost any time he talks about something Jewish, he goes way out of his way to explain what it means and where it comes from, okay? We think that authors have an idea of a secondary audience. Greek-speaking Jewish people might read this, okay? And there's some evidence in his work that he tells us, I'm writing special things to these. There's even some evidence that he wrote maybe an Aramaic piece to the Jews. But this work is written for a Greco-Roman or Hellenistic audience. Now, this is a big topic. What are the themes he's trying to accomplish in Antiquities? And this just reflects sort of Josephus' scholarship. First and foremost, he's defending the antiquity of Jewish culture. And in Roman law, the respect given to any ancient religion was based on how old it was. Okay, that's one of the reasons that the Judaism didn't suffer the kinds of persecutions Christians did, because Judaism could prove an antiquity of their religion. But it's not just antiquity to protect yourself under the law. Josephus believed that this was the most ancient of cultures, and in his book Antiquities, he can trace it back to the very beginning, creation. He says, you know, Moses couldn't make any of the laws unless he understands creation first. And then he tells us Genesis 1 and 2. Number two, he's defending the Constitution, what we would call in Latter-day Saints the Law of Moses, as the politeia, as the ancient, universal, long-living, and the best constitution for governing people. This is a really profound aspect of Antiquities that he tracks through. And in his summary in Book 20, that's what he wants us to remember, the superiority of the Jewish constitution, their law, their way of law. And number three, the idea of moralizing history. Josephus believes, and I've got a great quote here, I'm going to do it right now. Since Moses desired to teach this lesson to his fellow citizens, he did not begin the arrangement of his laws with contracts and the rights of people with one another in a manner similar to others, but he led their thoughts up to God and the structure of the universe. He starts with the universe here. Our legislator, having shown that God possesses a virtue that is pure, thought human beings ought to try to participate in it. And he goes on to say that those who will live by the principles of this virtue of God manifested in this Constitution will be blessed, and those who don't will be cursed. And this is the moralizing of the history that Josephus is doing. A really fascinating way of retelling history. Okay, I'm going to just finalize this issue with this quote from a scholar. The Hellenistic era had witnessed the extension of the notion of nomos to cosmic portions, that means law, especially since the Stoics regarded nomos as the expression of ho kosmos. Man being cosmopolites, a man of the polis, must order his life by this cosmic nomos or universal law. So a solution to why Josephus includes this idea is that the people that would read his work would have seen the universality of law and universality of tabernacle going together to teach them about this wonderful universal kind of a God. And we've already read that quote. We've already read that quote, and we've already given you the conclusions. So let's go to number 4. Significance for the study of the history of Judaism. I'm going to skip this because that gives away what we're going to talk about. 1935, a really spectacular discovery was made in a place called Dur Europos, which is a place in Syria, where we discovered a Jewish synagogue that is fully stocked with Jewish art. Right? You look at that wall and you can hardly imagine that a Jewish person would have made this. And here we do have some depictions of the temple, okay? This is the depiction of Aaron's temple, okay? We don't have time to talk about any of the details of this. We're just trying to get you to see something here. Opposite on the wall of that is this temple, okay? Now, what does this mean? And unfortunately, lots of these aren't labeled. This one happens to be labeled. This is Aaron, so we're confident that's the temple. This one's not labeled. One of the first ones on the scene to talk about this said, when we see something like this, so developed, so un-Jewish-like in terms of art. See, the idea before 1935 was that Judaism didn't have any art. They didn't represent themselves or their God in art. And a guy named Erwin Goodenough studied this problem, and he looked at this temple and he said, you know what this is? This is Hellenistic Judaism. This is a Judaism that is completely Hellenized, and this temple teaches us, in the same way that Philo would teach us, through a whole series of numbers, okay? For example, if you look here, and I don't have a pointer actually, but if you count from the bottom up, you'll see there are 7 walls there of 7 colors. You'll see there's 10 pillars. There's sets of 3s. There's these little Greek tuches on the ceiling. And Goodenough proposed that the reason we had the Temple of Cosmos was a Hellenistic idea reflecting Platonism, much like what Philo was doing, okay? And so the initial response to this was Goodenough's very, very complex system that argues to us that parallel to Rabbinic Judaism was a sophisticated Hellenistic kind of Judaism that preserved temple things in a cosmic way. His arguments tend to be too complex, and people haven't been convinced by these arguments. And then we found something else, and this is the conclusion of what I want to say because we've only got 3 minutes left. They discovered a synagogue at Beit Alpha in Israel, and this synagogue, if you look at the very bottom, I can't find a colored picture of the whole thing, so I'm giving you a diagram here. What's at the very bottom here? It's the scene of Abraham and Isaac, right? What's the middle? It's the zodiac. And what's above it? Implements from the temple. So what do we really have here? We have preserved within Judaism in the 4th, 5th, and 6th century AD in the land of Israel, we have the idea of Temple of Cosmos, this combination of symbols that speak to us that this idea that Josephus tells us did survive within Judaism, and this juxtaposition of the zodiac with temple things. And in fact, we have, I should have shown you these two. This is that wonderful Abraham scene. Here is our wonderful zodiac, which people are still trying to get over in Israel. And the fact is they've dug up 4 more scenes just like this that have Abraham, they have a zodiac in the middle, and then they have a temple at the top. So in conclusion, let's see a couple of pictures here. Here's the wonderful synagogue at Tiberias, the Hamat Tiberias, and you'll see here we have lions on the bottom, but we have the zodiac juxtaposed with the temple scene. Here's another zodiac. Here's a close-up of this scene that has temple implements. And this is a really fascinating one. This was at Sepphoris, but it's largely destroyed, but it actually has a picture of Aaron in the middle there between the zodiac and the temple things at the top. So in conclusion, it's likely that textual and iconographic evidence suggests a form or diverse forms of Judaism that flourished in the early rabbinic period. And I think what's going to start emerging within scholarly circles is the understanding that there was a group of people, how they're related to rabbinic Judaism is unclear, but at least parallel to rabbinic Judaism. And it's not a Hellenistic Judaism, it's a temple priestly kind of Judaism. And it survives next to rabbinic Judaism, and eventually it tends to die out. And the rabbis take over this idea and turn it more into the idea of that the tabernacle is the earthly representation of a heavenly temple. But nevertheless, this idea has survived. It's survived both textually and also most dramatically, iconographically. And for Latter-day Saints, I think we can all be comforted to know that there's evidence that, in fact, people have shared our belief that what happens in these temples is of cosmic significance, the reality of binding heaven and the earth. Thank you. One quick question. Go.
What is the connection between the zodiac and the 12 tribes?
Depends on who you talk to.
What?
Well, depends on who you talk to. Typically, this becomes more of a symbol of sacred time than of the tribes. 12 can do lots of things, but this tends, we think, to be more connected with time than the tribes. Good.